She was going to die in a wedding dress. That was the thought that ran through Wren Ashworth's mind as the car flipped for the second time, glass raining down like something out of a nightmare she hadn't agreed to have. Not the thought of her mother. Not the thought of the company. Not even the thought of the man she'd caught, 48 hours earlier, with his tongue in another woman's mouth in the very office Wren was supposed to inherit. Just that. She was going to die in a wedding dress she hadn't even picked out yet, and somehow that felt like the most insulting part of all of it. The car screamed against the guardrail, sparks lighting up the dark like something celebratory, and for one long, suspended second, Wren Ashworth, 26 years old, 3 days from her 27th birthday, sole heir to the largest architecture and development empire on the eastern seaboard, genuinely believed this was how her story ended. It wasn't. But nobody had told her yet that surviving would turn out to be the easy part. If you love a story where a woman gets knocked down by everyone who's supposed to love her and gets back up wearing better shoes and worse intentions, hit that subscribe button right now, because this one is going to test every nerve you've got. Let's get into it. 3 days earlier, everything had still made sense. Wren had been sitting in the passenger seat of her own life, mostly by choice. She liked spreadsheets more than confrontation. She liked blueprints more than boardrooms. She had spent the last 4 years quietly, competently, running the design division of Ashworth Holdings while her fiancé, Julian Reyes, ran his mouth in every meeting that mattered, taking credit for buildings she had designed at 2 in the morning with cold coffee and warm ambition. She had let it happen. Not because she was foolish. People like to assume that about pretty women who stayed quiet. But because her mother's will was very specific and very cruel in the way that only a dying woman's love could be. Wren must be married before her 27th birthday, to a partner of sound reputation, or control of Ashworth Holdings passes in full to the board. 27. Married. Sound reputation. Her mother, God rest her complicated soul, had clearly never met anyone with a sound reputation in her entire life, but had decided her daughter deserved to go looking for one under a countdown clock. So Wren had said yes to Julian 2 years ago, and she had told herself that was love, because the alternative, admitting it was a business transaction wearing an engagement ring, was too depressing to sit with over breakfast. Then came Tuesday. She had gone to his office to drop off blueprints for the Corbin Tower renovation, the kind of ordinary, forgettable errand that should never end a person's entire understanding of their life. Instead, she'd opened the door to find Julian with his hand fisted in the hair of Vivian Marchetti. Yes, that Marchetti, of the Corbin Tower, of the family whose money Julian had apparently decided was a better long-term investment than Wren's love, and the sound that came out of Wren's throat wasn't a scream. It was a laugh. A short, disbelieving, almost polite laugh, the kind you make when the barista gets your order wrong for the 3rd time in a row and you've simply run out of the energy required to be upset about it. Oh, she'd said. Okay. Julian had scrambled up so fast he knocked over a lamp. Wren, baby, this isn't. Please don't finish that sentence, Wren said, already turning to leave. I've read enough badly written scripts to know exactly how it ends. She'd walked out with her spine so straight you could have used her as a level, and it wasn't until she got to her car, alone, doors locked, that she let herself shake. 3 days until her birthday. 3 days until the company that carried her mother's name. The mother who had died watching Wren build things instead of tearing them down. The mother whose last real words had been "don't let them take what you built," would be swallowed whole by a board of men who had never designed anything in their lives except their own severance packages. So Wren had done the only sensible thing a woman in her position could do. She panicked for exactly 11 minutes in a parking garage, and then she made a list. Quick tip before we go further. If you've ever made a life-altering decision using a bullet point list on the Notes app of your phone at 11 p.m., comment "List Girl" below, because Wren was that girl, and it's about to change everything. Item 1. Cancel wedding. Item 2. Do not cry in front of Celeste. Item 3. Find a husband. Sound reputation preferred. Beggars, however, could not be choosers, given the timeline. Item 4. Survive. It was item 4 that turned out to be the tricky one. The accident happened the following night, on the private road that curved down from the Ashworth estate toward the city, the same road Wren had driven 1,000 times without incident, the same road that suddenly had no guardrail exactly where her brakes stopped responding. She would think about that detail a lot, later. How specific it was. How a road that had never failed her before chose that exact night, 2 days before her birthday, to let her down in every sense of the word. The car went through the rail at the one curve where the drop was steepest, and Wren Ashworth, who had spent her whole life being the responsible one, the reasonable one, the one who read the terms and conditions, found herself doing the least reasonable thing imaginable, surviving a rollover that should have killed her, crawling out of a wrecked car with blood in her hair and her mother's ring somehow still on her finger, and laughing. Because of course someone wanted her dead before she even had the chance to fix her own wedding. A man found her 20 minutes later. Not a paramedic, not a passerby. A man in a suit that had clearly not been purchased for standing on the side of a dark road, kneeling in gravel, without a flicker of concern for the fabric, checking her pulse with hands that were far too steady for someone looking at a woman covered in blood. "You're alive," he said. Not a question. An observation, delivered the way a man might note that it had started to rain. "Unfortunately for whoever did this," Wren rasped. "Yes." That got something out of him. Not quite a smile. The idea of one, filed away for later use. His name, she would learn before the night was over, was Cashinvale, and the very first thing she noticed about him, before the sharp jaw, before the eyes that looked like they'd priced out every person they'd ever met, before the unhurried way he moved like violence was simply a language he was fluent in but rarely bothered to speak, was that he did not ask a single question about what had happened to her car. He already knew. That should have terrified her more than it did. Here's where things get interesting, and if you're new here, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because trust me, you're going to want to be part of this conversation by the end. Cashinvale did not belong to the world of blueprints and boardrooms that Wren had spent her life in. He belonged to a world that ran underneath it, the way plumbing runs underneath a house nobody thinks about until something floods. The Vale name meant something in certain rooms. Rooms where men stopped talking when a Vale walked in, not out of respect exactly, but out of the specific caution people reserve for things that can bite. Wren didn't know any of that yet. All she knew, sitting in the back of an unmarked black car that smelled like leather and quiet menace, was that this stranger had looked at her ruined wedding, her ruined car, and her ruined timeline, and made her an offer so absurd she almost asked him to repeat it. "Marry me," Cashin said, like he was suggesting they split an appetizer. Wren blinked at him. "I'm sorry, did the crash concuss you? Or was it always this bad? You need a husband in 2 days, or you lose everything your mother built." He said it flatly, no cruelty in it, just fact, laid out like a blueprint. "I need a wife whose name doesn't come with the kind of attention mine does. It's not romance. It's architecture. Two structures propping each other up. That is," Wren said slowly, "the least romantic marriage proposal I have ever heard, and I once got proposed to over a spreadsheet. I'm not interested in romance. Clearly, I'm interested in you not dying before Thursday." Well, when he put it that way, let's pause right here for a second, because I want you to really sit in this moment with Wren, a woman who has just survived an assassination attempt, been cheated on by a man who apparently thought Wren's love was the least valuable thing in the room, and is now being proposed to by a stranger with a jaw like a filing cabinet and the emotional warmth of one too. If this were you, would you say yes? Comment below. I want to know, because Wren's answer might surprise you. She said yes. Not because it was romantic. Not because her heart did anything embarrassing in her chest, though it would, eventually, later, against her better judgment. She said yes because she was tired of being the reasonable one and losing anyway, and because something about the way Cashinvale looked at problems, like they were structural, solvable, beneath him, made her think that for the first time in years, she might actually be on a team instead of standing alone on a very expensive stage pretending she had backup. "Fine," she said, "but I wanted in writing that this is temporary." Something flickered behind his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or the specific look of a man who had just won an argument he hadn't told the other person they were having. "Everything's temporary," Cashin said, "until it isn't." They were married 2 days later in a courthouse that smelled like burnt coffee and bureaucracy, Wren in a cream dress she'd bought off the rack in a panic, because nothing says, "I am handling this beautifully," like sizing up in a department store dressing room while your assistant googles, "How fast can you legally get married?" And Cashin in the same suit he seemed to own 11 identical copies of. The officiant, A tired woman named Doris who had clearly seen every category of terrible decision a person could make in that very room, looked between them and asked, "Do either of you need a minute?" "No," Wren and Cashin said, at exactly the same time, in exactly the same tone, and for one absurd second they looked at each other, and something passed between them that was almost funny. If you're the kind of person who believes a courthouse wedding can somehow be sweeter than a 500-guest event with a swan eye sculpture, smash that like button, because Wren's story is about to prove you right in the strangest way possible. Vows were exchanged with the emotional depth of a business memo. Rings were placed on fingers with all the tenderness of two people signing for a delivery. And when Doris finally said the words that made it legal, Cashin leaned down and kissed Wren's cheek. Not her mouth, a small mercy, or maybe a calculated one, and murmured, low enough that only she could hear it, "Try not to look so relieved. People will think I'm a bargain." Wren laughed before she could stop herself. Actually laughed, the real kind, the kind she hadn't done since before Julian's office door. "You're not a bargain," she muttered back. "You're a hostile takeover with good tailoring. I've been called worse. I'll bet." She had no idea, at that point, exactly how much worse. By the time she called a press conference 2 days later, Wren Ashworth had transformed from a woman the tabloids had quietly started calling "poor Wren," jilted heiress, into a headline nobody in her family had prepared for. Ashworth heiress survives crash, marries reclusive businessman Cashin Vale in secret ceremony. She stood at the podium in a blazer sharp enough to cut glass, her hair pulled back, a fresh bruise on her collarbone artfully covered by a silk scarf, and she looked directly into the cameras with the specific calm of a woman who had run out of things to lose. "I'm aware there's been speculation about the accident, about my engagement, and about my marriage," she said, voice steady, chin up. "I'll address all three at once. I survived. I moved on. And I'm still here. Short, sharp, devastatingly effective." Somewhere in the back of the room, her sister Celeste Ashworth sat with her arms crossed so tightly it looked painful, her face doing the complicated work of trying to look supportive and betrayed at exactly the same time. Their uncle Malcolm, meanwhile, sat one row up, in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, watching Wren with the kind of attention a man gives a chessboard right before he decides which piece to sacrifice. Nobody clapped. Nobody was supposed to. This wasn't that kind of press conference. But somewhere in that room, a decision was made, quiet, private, dangerous, that Wren Ashworth had just become a much bigger problem than anyone had accounted for. And if you think that press conference was the last time Wren would have to stand in front of a room full of people who wanted her gone, you have severely underestimated what this family is capable of. Stick around, because it only gets worse from here. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss what happens at the shareholders' meeting. Celeste cornered her in the parking garage afterward, heels clicking against concrete with the particular fury of a younger sister who has spent her whole life being told to be more like Wren. "You married a criminal," Celeste hissed. 2 days after your fiancé cheated on you. Do you understand how that looks? "I understand how it looks a lot better than I understand how nearly dying in a car with no guardrail looks," Wren said evenly. "Where were you that night, Cel?" Something flickered across Celeste's face. Too fast to name, too specific to be nothing. "That's not fair." "No," Wren agreed. "It isn't." She didn't wait for a response. She got into the black car idling at the curb, where Cashin sat scrolling through something on his phone with the unbothered patience of a man who had already read tomorrow's headlines today. "Family reunion go well?" he asked, not looking up. "Wonderfully," Wren said, buckling her seatbelt like she was strapping in for battle. "Turns out my sister thinks marrying you was the scandal, not almost dying." Cashin finally glanced over, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "People will believe whatever's easiest to believe. It's cheaper than the truth." "And what's the truth?" He didn't answer right away. The car pulled out into traffic, city lights sliding across his face in slow gold streaks, and for a moment Wren thought he simply wasn't going to. "The truth," he said finally, "is that somebody in your family wanted you dead before your birthday, and it wasn't your sister who benefits most from that." Wren's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the car's speed. "Then who?" Cashin didn't answer that either. Not yet. The following 2 weeks blurred into a strange new rhythm neither of them had signed up for out loud. but both seemed to slide into with unsettling ease. Wren went back to Ashworth Holdings to find her office had been quietly reassigned for renovations. Her design proposals mysteriously stuck in approval limbo, and a board that suddenly found new confidence in openly questioning her competence now that there was a scandal attached to her name. Meanwhile, at the Vale estate, a house so large Wren got lost twice trying to find the kitchen, and so quiet it made her wonder what kind of family raised a man like Cashin in it. She learned the specific comedy of trying to build a marriage with a man who treated affection like a security risk. "You could knock," she told him the third time he walked into what was apparently now their bedroom without warning, holding a laptop and a look of mild irritation, as she sat cross-legged on the bed in an old college t-shirt, hair in a messy bun, going through renovation blueprints. "It's my house. It's also my room now, allegedly. So the least you could do is pretend to respect boundaries like a normal husband." "I'm not a normal husband." "No kidding." But he set the laptop down anyway, and sat at the far edge of the bed, and after a moment, without looking at her, said, "What are you working on?" And Wren, who had spent 2 years with a fiancé who never once asked her that question with real interest, found herself explaining the Corbin Tower redesign in more detail than she'd meant to, watching this terrifying, unreadable man actually listen, actually nod at the right places, actually ask a follow-up question about load-bearing structure that told her he'd genuinely absorbed what she said. It shouldn't have made her chest go warm. It absolutely did anyway. If you've ever fallen for someone by accident, purely because they listened to you talk about something you loved without checking their phone once, you already know exactly what's about to happen to Wren. And if you're enjoying this slow burn, make sure you're subscribed, because the next few scenes are going to test whether Cashin Vale is actually capable of loving anyone at all. The threats started small. A car following a little too closely. A florist delivery to the estate containing no card, only white lilies, funeral flowers, arranged with unsettling precision. A phone call to Wren's private line, the number nobody outside family should have had, where nobody spoke, just breathed, for 11 long seconds before hanging up. Cashin's response to all of it was the same, a slight tightening around his eyes, a phone call made behind closed doors in a language Wren didn't speak, and 2 more men suddenly present at the estate whose job titles were never explained and never needed to be. "You're being careful," Wren observed one evening, watching one of the new men, built like a filing cabinet himself, though with considerably less personality, check the perimeter of the garden before letting her step out onto it. "I'm being thorough," Cashin corrected. "Careful implies I think there's a chance of failure. That's not remotely comforting." It wasn't meant to be comforting. It was meant to be true. Wren laughed despite herself. A real laugh. The kind that had become rarer and rarer over the last 2 years, and was somehow becoming common again in the company of a man who had all the emotional range of a locked safe. "You know, for someone who claims not to be interested in romance, you're doing an awful lot of protecting for a business arrangement." Something shifted in his expression, brief and dangerous, like a door left open half an inch. "Structures fail when you don't reinforce them properly." Is that a metaphor for us? Or are you just always thinking about buildings? "Both," he admitted, and for the first time, it sounded like the truth costing him something to say. It was 3 weeks into the marriage, on a Thursday that started ordinary and ended anything but, that Wren walked into the Ashworth boardroom to find the entire table already seated, files stacked in front of each of them, faces arranged in the particular neutral expressions people wear right before they detonate something. Uncle Malcolm sat at the head of the table, her mother's old seat, technically Wren's now, though he'd never once acknowledged that with anything but a thin, patient smile. "Wren," he said warmly, the way a man greets someone he's about to legally ruin. "Sit. We have some things to discuss about your continued fitness to lead this company." And just like that, the real war began. Quick reminder before we continue. Comment the word boardroom if you already have a bad feeling about Uncle Malcolm, because trust me, your instincts are about to be proven exactly right. The accusations came dressed up as concern. Her judgment, they said, had been compromised, first by a public scandal with her ex-fiancé, then by a rushed marriage to a man with, and here Malcolm's smile had gone especially thin, significant reputational complications. Her recent absence from the office. Her design division's stalled approvals. Wren noted with a spike of fury, that had been stalled by this very board. You want to remove me, Wren said flatly, cutting through 20 minutes of corporate theater, because I survived an attempt on my life and married someone you don't approve of. We want, Malcolm said gently, like correcting a child. What's best for the company your mother built? My mother built this company for me to run it, not for you to circle it like it's already dead. The room went very quiet. There will be a formal shareholder vote, Malcolm said, unbothered, folding his hands. In 3 weeks' time. Until then, perhaps some time away would serve you well, Wren. For your health. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a countdown, dressed in concern, and Wren understood with total clarity that she had exactly 3 weeks to prove she deserved the name on the building or watch it get stripped from her the same way everything else had almost been stripped from her this year. She left the boardroom with her spine straight and her hands shaking, and it wasn't until she was in the elevator, alone, doors closed, that she let the mask slip for exactly 4 seconds. For seconds, that was all she allowed herself. Then the doors opened, and she walked out like nothing had happened at all, because that was the only version of Wren Ashworth anyone in that building was allowed to see. Cashin was waiting outside, leaning against the car with the particular stillness of a man who already knew exactly how the meeting had gone before she said a word. They're moving faster than I expected, he said, opening the door for her. You knew this was coming? I suspected it. He got in beside her, jaw tight in a way she was learning meant he was furious and choosing, very deliberately, not to show it. Your uncle's been maneuvering for control of Ashworth Holdings for longer than you've been paying attention. The accident, the timing of it, 2 days before your birthday, that wasn't coincidence, Wren. Someone needed you gone, or married to someone controllable, before that deadline hit. Wren stared at him. And you weren't controllable. No, Cashin said. Which means, as far as your uncle's concerned, marrying me solved one problem and created a much bigger one. So what do we do? Cashin looked at her for a long moment, something calculating and, underneath it, something that looked almost like respect. We win the vote. And then we find out exactly how deep this goes. That's simple. Nothing about this is simple, he said. But you're going to need to be sharper than every person in that room, every single day, for the next 3 weeks. Can you do that? Wren thought about the woman who'd laughed in a burning wreck instead of screaming. The woman who'd said, I'm still here, into 100 cameras with a bruise hidden under silk. The woman who had built half this company's most celebrated designs while a man who didn't deserve her took the credit for years and never once heard her complain. I've been sharper than everyone in that room my whole life, Wren said. They just never bothered to notice. Cashin's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Wren felt it land somewhere under her ribs. Then let's make sure they never get the chance to forget it again. The 3 weeks that followed were a masterclass in quiet warfare. Wren rebuilt alliances she'd let go slack, courted shareholders who'd written her off as a scandal-adjacent liability, and pulled 14-hour days pushing the Corbin Tower redesign. Her design, her vision, finally credited under her own name for the first time in years, back onto the table as proof of exactly why she belonged in that chair. Cashin, for his part, did something Wren hadn't expected. He stayed out of it. Not absent. Never absent. Not with the threats still circling like sharks that hadn't decided whether the water was worth the risk, but careful not to fight her battle for her. You could just make this go away, Wren pointed out one night, exhausted, ink on her fingers from marking up blueprints at midnight. You clearly have the kind of resources that make problems disappear. I could, Cashin agreed. But then it wouldn't be your win. And your uncle would spend the rest of his life telling everyone I bought your seat for you. So this is about my reputation. This is about the fact that you're better at this than any of them, Cashin said, simply, like it wasn't even a compliment, just an observation of load-bearing fact. You don't need me to win. You need me to make sure nobody kills you before you get the chance. It was, Wren realized with something between horror and helpless affection, the single most romantic thing anyone had said to her in 2 years, and it had been delivered with all the warmth of a structural engineering report. She was in so much trouble. If you're already rooting for these two idiots to fall in love properly, drop a heart in the comments, because the shareholders meeting is coming up next, and it's about to change absolutely everything. The morning of the vote, Wren stood in front of the mirror in a navy suit sharp enough to cut through every ounce of doubt anyone in that boardroom still had about her, her mother's ring on her finger beside the wedding band that had started somewhere in the last 3 weeks, to feel less like a business arrangement and more like an anchor she genuinely wanted holding her down. Cashin appeared in the doorway, adjusting his cufflinks, watching her with an expression she still hadn't fully learned to read. "Nervous?" he asked. "Terrified," Wren admitted. "But I've been terrified since the day my mother died and left me a company and a countdown clock instead of a hug. I've gotten used to doing things scared." Cashin crossed the room, and for a moment Wren thought he might say something. Something real, something that cracked the careful architecture he kept around himself. But instead he reached out and straightened her collar, a small, unnecessary gesture that felt enormous in the quiet of that room. "You're going to win today," he said. "And when you do, I need you to remember something." "What's that?" "Whatever happens in that room, however it happens, it's real. The company's staying yours. That part's real. Don't let anyone convince you it isn't." It was a strange thing to say, oddly specific. Wren would think about it later and wonder how much of the future he'd already seen coming. The boardroom was packed by the time Wren walked in. Every shareholder, every board member, Uncle Malcolm at the head of the table wearing the calm, patient smile of a man who believed he had already won. Celeste seated near the back, arms crossed, unreadable. The vote proceeded exactly as Malcolm had clearly planned it to. Accusations of instability, of a marriage that raised more questions than it answered, of a shareholder base losing confidence in Wren's ability to lead. Numbers were read aloud. Percentages. The room did the quiet math of who had bought whose loyalty and how. And then, just as Malcolm rose to call for the final tally, the moment where 3 weeks of careful, exhausting work would either hold or shatter. Wren stood, straightened the jacket Cashin had fixed that morning, and placed a single folder on the table. "Before we vote," she said, voice carrying clean and steady across the room, "I think everyone should know that the shareholder composition in this room has changed significantly in the last 72 hours. Malcolm's smile flickered. "Just barely." "Excuse me." 12% of shares previously held by outside investors were quietly acquired this week. Wren continued, opening the folder, sliding copies down the table with the calm precision of a woman who had rehearsed this exact moment in the mirror at 2 in the morning. "Which means, as of this meeting, I hold clear majority control. Not enough votes to remove me, Uncle Malcolm. Nowhere close." The room erupted into a controlled kind of chaos. Murmurs, papers shuffling, Malcolm's face doing something complicated behind a mask that was cracking faster than he could repair it. "That's not possible," he said, too sharply, too fast, the calm finally slipping. "Those shares were what?" Wren asked, and something in her voice went very quiet, very sharp. "Say it, Uncle Malcolm. Finish that sentence." He didn't. He couldn't. Not in front of a room full of witnesses. And the vote, when it finally happened, minutes later, in a room gone tense and electric, confirmed exactly what Wren already knew. She kept her seat. She kept the company. She kept her mother's name on the building. She had won. And for one bright, golden, triumphant moment, walking out of that boardroom with her head high and Cashin's hand finding the small of her back like it belonged there, Wren Ashworth believed, genuinely, fully believed, that the worst of it was over. She had absolutely no idea how wrong she was. That night, in the quiet of the Vale estate, with champagne she hadn't finished sitting warm on the table and Cashin across from her looking, for once, almost relaxed, Wren asked the question she'd been too exhausted to ask before. "Those shares," she said, "the 12%, where did they actually come from? I never authorized any acquisition." Cashin's expression didn't change, exactly, but something in the room's temperature did. "I handled it," he said. "You didn't need the details." "I think I do, actually. It's my company, Cashin." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something, and when he finally spoke, his voice was careful in a way that made Wren's stomach turn cold before she even understood why. "The shares were purchased through a private holding firm," Cashin said slowly, "to keep my involvement quiet. Standard practice. Except," he stopped. "Except what?" "Except the firm that processed the transaction," Cashin said, and for the first time since Wren had met him, something that looked almost like dread crossed his face, "was retained by your uncle's law office. Years ago, before any of this started." The champagne glass in Wren's hand went very still. "That's not possible." she whispered. The exact words Malcolm himself had used in the boardroom hours earlier, and the echo of it crawled up her spine like something cold and alive. Because if the firm that quietly, secretly saved her company was the same firm her uncle had used for years, that meant one of two things. Either it was an extraordinary coincidence, or Uncle Malcolm had known, the entire time, exactly whose money was saving her, and had let her win anyway. Which meant he wanted her to believe she'd beaten him. Which meant the real game hadn't even started yet. Somewhere across the city, in an office with the lights still on long after the building should have emptied for the night, Uncle Malcolm poured himself a drink, looked out at the skyline that carried his sister's name on it, and smiled the exact smile of a man who has just watched his opponent walk directly into a trap she didn't know she was standing in. Let her have her little victory, he murmured to no one, swirling the glass. She has no idea whose favor she's really in. And that, dear viewer, is exactly where we're going to leave things for now. If your jaw is currently on the floor, comment Malcolm right now, because we need to talk about just how deep this betrayal really goes. And make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications on, because part 2 is where everything Wren thinks she's won gets pulled right out from under her. Cash unveils coma, Wren's pregnancy, the truth about Marcus's betrayal, Uncle Malcolm's real endgame. It's all coming. Don't miss it.